arrive in sealed envelopes from lawyers in which was the cruelest possible hour arrive in the worst corner because that was the hour when sleep in a structure everyone agreed was worthless started meaning something. Beneath a wire floor Torres had worked a double shift at their hands and knees to examine 11 hours of lifting and turning. The difference between them is not in what they people who sometimes it is in the kind of attention it takes to find them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. For 2 hours and if you love this story, when the vibration check out the other videos on your screen nightstand, I think you'll really enjoy the dark like a and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Before she was fully conscious. See you in the next story. The voice on the other end was her brother Richard, and even half asleep she noticed that he didn't say sorry for calling so early, didn't ask if she was awake, didn't offer any cushion at all, just delivered the news the way he delivered everything, which was like a person who'd rehearsed the right words until they stopped meaning anything. Dad's gone. Maya sat up in the dark of her apartment, the one that smelled perpetually of the neighbors cooking and the slow leak under the bathroom sink she couldn't afford to have fixed. She listened to her brother say the word hard and the word fast and the word peaceful, and she heard something else underneath all of it, something that had no name yet, but that her body recognized before her mind could catch up. She pressed her palm flat against the mattress and felt the springs give beneath it, and she didn't cry. Not yet. She was too tired, and also there was something in Richard's voice that was already calculating even at 4 in the morning, and something about that calculation made her want to keep herself very still and very quiet and wait to understand what was coming. Eduardo Torres had been 68 years old. He had farmed the same 47 acres in Tulare County, California, for 31 years. He'd grown peaches and almonds, and, in the final decade when his knees gave out and the big operations started squeezing the margins on stone fruit, he'd kept a modest flock of chickens that he tended with more patience than he'd given many people in his life. He was not a complicated man. He was not a warm man, not in any way that announced itself clearly. But he had worked that land the way some men pray, daily and without expectation of applause, and the land had given back what it could. Maya had not been the favorite. She understood this the way children understand most things about their parents, not through announcement, but through accumulation, through the 100 small moments that add up to a portrait no one ever hangs on the wall, but everyone knows is there. Richard was the eldest, the one who went to law school and came back with the kind of confidence that fills a room. Sandra was the middle child, the beautiful one who married Gerald Whitmore of Whitmore Development Associates and moved into a house in Fresno with 4 bedrooms and a pool that nobody swam in because nobody had the time. Maya was the youngest. Maya was the one who got pregnant at 27 by a man who turned out to be allergic to permanents. Maya was the one who stayed in Visalia and worked night shifts and raised 2 children on a schedule that left no margin for error and very little margin for sleep. She had called her father every Sunday. That was the whole of it, and she was not ashamed of it. She had called every Sunday and listened to him talk about the almonds and the water table and the neighbor dispute over the eastern fence line. And she had put Diego on the phone so her father could hear his grandson's voice. And sometimes her father said things like, "You're doing all right, Emija," and she held those words for a long time afterward because they were the most he knew how to give her. The funeral was in Porterville on a Wednesday, and Maya drove the 3 hours with her 2 kids strapped into the back seat of her 2009 Corolla, which had 187,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that had been on for so long she'd stopped noticing it. Lily sat with her book open but her eyes out the window, doing the quiet processing that 11-year-olds sometimes do when they decide grief is a private thing. Diego was 7 and he asked twice if Grandpa Eduardo was in heaven and twice if heaven had chickens, and Maya said yes to both because certainty was the only comfort that worked at 7. She had $314 in her checking account. She had $28 in cash in her wallet. She had a Visa card with a $4,200 limit and $3,890 already on it from the month Diego's ear infection turned out to need specialist care. She had 2 weeks of groceries if she planned carefully and 1 week if the kids kept growing at the rate they were currently growing. She was thinking about all of this as she drove, running the numbers the way she always ran them, in the background of whatever else was happening, the financial arithmetic of a life that required constant management just to stay in the same place. Richard was waiting outside the funeral home when she arrived. He had aged well in the way that men with money tend to age, which is to say the gray in his temples looked distinguished and the lines around his eyes looked like wisdom. He was wearing a suit that had been properly tailored to his body, which was a thing Maya had spent enough time helping residents button their jackets to recognize immediately. He hugged her briefly, the way people hug when physical contact is obligatory rather than desired, and he asked about the drive, and she said fine, and that was the whole of their emotional exchange for the day. Sandra was inside talking to the funeral director, her voice warm and carrying authority the way her voice always carried authority since she'd married Gerald and inherited along with his last name a sense that her preferences were naturally the correct ones. She embraced Maya with more warmth than Richard had managed, which was not difficult, and she said, "Oh, you look tired," in a tone that made it sound like a flaw in Maya's character rather than an observation about her circumstances. The service itself was attended by 17 people. Some of them were neighbors Maya didn't recognize. A man named Hector, who had apparently helped Eduardo with the irrigation 3 seasons running, came and shook everyone's hand with both of his. The pastor gave a eulogy that was generic enough to apply to any farmer in the valley and specific enough that Maya understood he had spoken to Richard on the phone beforehand to gather the details. She sat between her children and held Diego's hand and thought about her father's voice on Sunday mornings, about the way he pronounced her name with the accent she'd tried to copy as a child and never quite managed. After the burial, they went back to the farmhouse, which was the only thing that made sense even though the farmhouse had been empty for 8 months since Eduardo had been moved to a care facility with a hip that wouldn't recover, and a diagnosis that required more help than any of his children had the time or proximity to provide. Maya had contributed to his care facility costs for 7 months, $180 a month, which she had managed by dropping one of her 2 streaming subscriptions and eating rice and beans 3 nights a week and not replacing her work shoes until the sole started separating at the toe. Richard and Sandra had contributed the remainder. Neither of them had mentioned this in her presence, but she knew, because she had done the math. The farmhouse smelled of disuse and old wood, and something sweet underneath that might have been the peaches from the trees that still stood in the North Grove, their fruit going unpicked now for 2 seasons. The furniture was what it had always been, heavy and dark and bought for durability rather than beauty. Eduardo's chair still sat beside the window that looked out toward the almond trees. Nobody sat in it. Richard made coffee. Sandra set out food that she had brought, careful containers of casserole and sliced fruit, and a store-bought pie that was fancier than anything that had ever been eaten in that kitchen. They sat around the table that Eduardo had sat around for 31 years, and for a while they talked about him, about the small concrete things that make up a person when you strip away the mythology. How he'd kept every tool in its assigned place. How he'd named one of the chickens after a television personality he disliked. How he'd watered the almond trees by hand in the season after the irrigation pump failed because he didn't want them to suffer for something that wasn't their fault. And then Richard set down his coffee cup and said, "We should talk about the estate." Maya's body registered this before her brain caught up. That settling feeling, something tightening below the sternum. Richard was an attorney. He had drawn up the will himself, which should perhaps have been a warning, but which at the time had seemed like a practical solution, the kind of thing you do when you have a brother who knows how these things work. He laid out the terms with the calm efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this conversation since before the funeral, possibly since before the death itself. The farmhouse and the surrounding 12 acres of maintained grounds would go to Richard. This was because Richard had organized the final years of care, coordinated with the facility, managed the paperwork. Eduardo had wanted to compensate this. Richard said this without a trace of apology or irony. The almond grove and the north 22 acres would go to Sandra and Gerald, who had the resources and the connections to manage agricultural land productively. Eduardo had wanted to see the land continue producing rather than sit idle. Sandra nodded at this with an expression of gracious acceptance. The east orchard and the remaining 9 acres would be divided between Richard and Sandra on a 70-30 split that Richard explained with several legal terms Maya didn't bother to parse because she was already doing a different kind of math, which left approximately 4 acres in the southeast corner of the property, which contained the old equipment shed that had collapsed 2 winters ago, a dry creek bed of no agricultural value, and the chicken run. Richard said the words chicken run with the same neutral precision he'd used for all the other terms, and Maya looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at Sandra, who was looking at her plate. The chicken run, Richard continued, consisting of the structure and the surrounding quarter-acre, had been designated specifically for Maya. Eduardo had wanted to ensure all 3 children received something. The chicken run had been in continuous use and represented a functioning portion of the operation. It was a gesture of inclusion. Maya was quiet for long enough that Diego looked up from the corner where he'd been drawing in his notebook and found her face, and then looked away again, the way children do when they sense an adult is holding something large and invisible. She asked, very quietly, if there was a copy of the will she could read herself. Richard produced it from a folder that was already on the table. She read it. It said what he'd said it said. It was legally executed, witnessed by 2 names she didn't recognize, notarized. It was real. Lily had come to stand behind Maya's chair at some point during the reading, and Maya felt her daughter's hands settle on her shoulders, light and careful, and that weight was the thing that almost broke her open right there in her father's kitchen. But she didn't let it. She put the will back on the table and she thanked Richard for explaining everything clearly, and she asked where the bathroom was even though she knew exactly where it was, and she walked down the hall and closed the door and stood at the sink and ran the cold water and pressed her wrists under it until her breathing slowed to something manageable. She stayed in there for 4 minutes. She counted. When she came back out, Sandra was talking about property management companies, and Richard was talking about the timeline for the estate transfer, and Diego was still drawing in his notebook, and Lily was watching Maya with the particular quality of attention that children give adults they're worried about. Maya sat back down. She poured more coffee. She did not say any of the things that were moving through her body like weather. The conversation about the estate lasted another 40 minutes. There was a discussion of tax implications that Richard navigated with confident boredom. There was a discussion of the almond harvest and whether it made more sense to bring in contract workers or negotiate with one of the larger operations to take the grove on a managed lease. Sandra mentioned that Gerald had a contact at a development firm that might be interested in the eastern land if the agricultural value didn't pencil out. The conversation moved around Maya like a river around a stone. At one point, Richard said something about the chicken run that was meant to be generous, a kind of here's the bright side offering, which was that even a small parcel of land had value as collateral and that Maya could use it as an asset if she ever needed to access credit. He said this without any apparent awareness of how it landed, which was like offering someone who was drowning information about swimming lessons. Sandra's contribution was equally sincere in its catastrophic miscalculation. She said, "At least you have something," and she meant this not unkindly, but also not with any real understanding of what it meant to have something that was a quarter-acre of chicken wire and packed dirt when you had 2 children and $314 in your checking account. Maya drove back to Visalia that evening with both children sleeping in the back seat. Diego's head tipped sideways against his stuffed armadillo. Lily curled into the corner, with her knees pulled up. The dashboard said it was 91 degrees outside. The car's air conditioning had stopped working 18 months ago, and she'd driven with the windows down all summer, which meant the interior smelled like valley heat and dust and the specific warm staleness of a car that carries children everywhere. She drove and she thought about the chicken run. She had seen it exactly twice in her adult life. Once when she brought Lily out for a weekend when Lily was 3, and once when she came for her father's 65th birthday 4 years ago. It was a long rectangular structure with walls of heavy gauge wire on a wooden frame, maybe 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a covered section at one end where Eduardo had kept the nesting boxes and the feed. The floor was the original wire mesh, strung over wooden beams, with packed earth visible beneath it. There was a roofed section over perhaps a third of the length, tin sheeting that had gone brown with rust, but still shed rain adequately. The rest was open to the sky under a secondary wire canopy that kept hawks out, but let light through. It was not livable. It was barely functional as a chicken run, Eduardo having reduced his flock in the final years to 6 or 8 birds that had given up laying with any enthusiasm. It had no electricity connection and no water other than the outdoor spigot on the south wall. The wooden frame showed rot at the base posts. 3 sections of wire were torn or loose. It smelled, as all chicken runs smell, of an animal life that had moved through and left its evidence behind. But it was hers. She turned this over during the drive the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath, looking for something useful, some angle of the situation that made sense from a practical standpoint. She could sell the quarter-acre. Except there was no road access to that corner of the property, and Richard's 12 acres sat between the chicken run and the county road, which meant any sale would require an easement agreement with Richard, which she was not prepared to negotiate in good faith. She could lease it, theoretically, for pasture or equipment storage, but it would take months to find a tenant, and she needed an answer in weeks. She could walk away from it entirely and let it sit, which was the option that cost her nothing now and gained her nothing ever. Or she could go back. This thought arrived not dramatically but quietly, the way practical thoughts arrive when desperation removes the luxury of deciding things on principle. She could go back to the property. She and the kids. She could live in the chicken run, or at the edge of it, or in whatever way the structure would accommodate human beings who needed a roof and walls, however inadequate, while she figured out the next step. Her apartment lease was up in 6 weeks. The rent had gone up $40 a month at the last renewal, and she'd managed it, barely, by picking up a Saturday shift, but the landlord had mentioned at the last walkthrough that the unit was going to be listed at market rate when the next lease cycle came up, which meant a number she couldn't reach from where she was standing. The math of staying in Visalia was getting worse, not better, and the math of going back to her father's land, even to the dismissed, mocked, swept-aside quarter-acre of it, was at least a math she could affect. She called Richard from a gas station parking lot while the kids ate chips inside, their heads bent together over something on Lily's phone. She told him she was going to take the property. She said it plainly, without asking permission and without the apologetic softening she usually applied to statements that she imagined might inconvenience someone. She was going to accept the inheritance, and she was going to go back to the farm. There was a pause. Then Richard said, to his credit, that was fine, that the estate transfer would take 6 to 8 weeks through probate, that she should contact his office with any questions. He did not say what she heard underneath the words, which was, "Of course you are, because you don't have anywhere else to go." She filled the tank with the last of the cash in her wallet, and they drove the rest of the way home in the dark. She gave notice to her landlord the next morning. She told her supervisor at Ridgecrest that she needed to take a leave, and she explained the situation with the clarity of someone who didn't have the option of softening the facts with extra words. Her supervisor was a woman named Pat who had been in geriatric care for 30 years and who processed other people's difficulties with the same steady calm she brought to everything. And Pat said to take as much time as she needed, and that there was a position if she came back, or a reference if she needed one somewhere else. Lily took the news with the unsurprised gravity of an 11-year-old who had been paying close attention to the financial weather of their household for longer than any 11-year-old should have to. She asked 2 questions. The first was whether they would still have their own space. The second was whether there would be school nearby. Maya said yes to both, honestly to the second and hopefully to the first. Diego asked if they were going to live with the chickens. Maya said, maybe for a little while. He thought about this and then asked if he could name them. She said yes. He looked satisfied and went back to his armadillo. They drove to Tulare County on a Thursday in late October, which is one of the better times of year to be in the southern San Joaquin Valley, if you have to be there at all, the heat having retreated enough that the air had a quality to it that almost justified the word beautiful. The valley in October carries the smell of almond hulls and dried grass and distant smoke from the controlled burns that farmers use to clear debris, and the light in the afternoon goes gold and low in a way that makes even the irrigation ditches and the flat, dusty logic of agricultural land look briefly like somewhere people chose to be on purpose. Maya had loaded the car with everything that mattered, which was not very much, and which had been clarified by the process of deciding what to take. Clothes and bedding. The cast-iron pan she'd had since her first apartment. Diego's school things and Lily's books and the shoebox of photographs that she'd moved with her 4 times now. Always the same box. Always the same photographs. The coffee maker. 2 good knives. A first aid kit. The rest had gone to a second-hand store, or into the dumpster, or into the hands of the woman downstairs who had admired Maya's curtains and who Maya had given them to without ceremony, because curtains are not the kind of thing you want to assign sentimental weight to. They arrived at the farm in the early afternoon. The main gate was padlocked, which it had not been in Eduardo's time, and Maya felt the padlock as a message even though it was also, functionally, just a padlock. Richard had sent her the access code for the outer gate in a text message that was entirely transactional and included no greeting or sign-off. She punched in the code and the gate swung open on a slow hydraulic arm that Eduardo certainly had not installed, which meant Richard had already been here, had already started making the property his in small, visible ways. The driveway was a dirt track that ran straight for a quarter-mile through the almond grove before branching right toward the farmhouse and left toward the equipment areas. She took the left branch, which was less worn, the wheel ruts softer and further apart from lesser use. The almond trees on either side had not been managed since Eduardo left, and the suckers had grown up thick at the base of the trunks, and some of the lower branches had sagged with the weight of the unpicked nuts that had dried and fallen, and she could see the ones on the ground crunching under her tires as she drove. The chicken run was at the back of the property, past the collapsed equipment shed whose corrugated metal walls had folded inward on themselves like a crumpling paper bag, past a concrete pad where Eduardo had parked his tractor, past the water tank that still stood on its wooden tower but showed a seam of rust along the belly that suggested its useful life was not indefinite. She stopped the car 20 feet from the structure and sat for a moment with the engine running before she turned it off. Lily looked at it through the windshield. Diego pressed his face against the side glass. It was worse, Maya registered, than she remembered it. Time and disuse had not been kind. The wooden posts at the base showed the gray-black staining of rot that had climbed 2 feet up from the ground, which meant the foundation of the frame was compromised in ways that she could see from the car and possibly in ways she couldn't yet see from anywhere. Several of the wire panels on the south wall had come free from their staples and hung outward at angles that suggested they'd been pushed from the inside, possibly by animals getting in or out after the chickens were gone. The tin roofing over the covered section had developed a depression in the center where a winter's worth of rain had pooled, and then the following summer's heat had baked it into a concave trap that would collect every future rain and add its weight to the already compromised structure. The ground around the perimeter was uneven, rutted and dry, the kind of ground that has been worked by animal feet and weather for years and then abandoned to its own contracting and heaving. A line of dried weeds had grown up along the west wall, chest-high, brown and brittle, the kind of growth that Maya's father would have cut down each fall. He had not been here to cut them this year. She got out of the car. The air smelled of dust and dry grass and, very faintly, of the ammonia and organic matter that is the permanent perfume of a structure that has housed chickens even after the chickens are gone. The smell wasn't overpowering. It was just present, the way a room always carries the scent of who has lived in it. Lily came to stand beside her. Diego was already moving toward the structure with the fearlessness of 7-year-olds, which is less fearlessness than a genuinely different assessment of what is dangerous. "Don't touch the wire," Maya said. "Why?" "Because it might be sharp or loose in ways we can't see yet." Diego accepted this with reasonable compliance and stopped a few feet from the nearest panel, studying it with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that was unconsciously Eduardo's, which struck Maya somewhere complicated. She walked the perimeter. She was doing what she always did when she encountered a problem too large to feel, which was to convert it into tasks. She was breaking the problem into the size of things that could be done in order, assessed and addressed and checked off, so that the whole of it didn't sit on her chest while she was trying to breathe. The south wall was the most compromised. She counted 7 wire panels that needed reattachment, 3 that needed replacement if she could source the right gauge. The west wall was better. Only 2 panels showing separation, and the connection points were only loose rather than broken, which meant they could be restapled without replacing the wire itself. The north wall, which was the wall that backed up against the covered section, was structurally the soundest, being partially sheltered from the weather by the tin roof's overhang. The covered section itself was the critical area. It was approximately 20 feet deep and 40 feet wide, and it had what the structure needed: a solid roof, walls on 3 sides, a gate on the 4th. It was not a room in any human sense, but it had the basic geometry of shelter. The floor was the thing she kept coming back to. The floor of the chicken run was the original wire mesh construction. Heavy-gauge hexagonal wires stapled to wooden beams that ran every 4 feet across the width of the structure, creating a grid of wire panels about 4 feet wide and of varying lengths depending on where the crossbeams fell. Beneath the wire, 8 inches down, was the packed earth floor. This design was standard for certain styles of chicken housing, meant to keep the birds separated from their own waste, the droppings falling through to the ground below, where they could be managed or left to decompose without creating a disease environment in the living area. The wire was old. In the covered section, it was covered with decades of compressed organic matter, the layered evidence of 30 years of chickens living and eating and moving and dying above it, which had compressed and partly decomposed into a substrate that was uneven but actually quite solid underfoot in the places where she tested it. In the open sections, the wire was more visible, less covered, and showed the original structure more clearly. She stood in the covered section and looked at the floor for a long time. Something about it was pulling at her attention in a way she couldn't immediately explain. The beams, the spacing. There was a regularity to the construction that seemed more deliberate than necessary for a chicken run. Most backyard chicken housing used whatever lumber was available, ran the beams wherever was convenient, sized the panels to the materials at hand. But the beams here were true 2x6s, properly spaced, laid with a precision that suggested someone had used a measuring tape and cared about the result. The corner joints showed mortise and tenon work, old-fashioned wood joinery that required skill and took considerably more effort than simply nailing boards together. Maya crouched down at the edge of the covered section where the accumulated matter on the wire was thinner and she could see the structure beneath. She was not a carpenter, but she had spent enough time listening to contractors describe work to care facility administrators that she knew the vocabulary of construction, and what she was looking at was not consistent with someone throwing together a chicken pen on a Saturday afternoon. The beams were old, possibly older than the wire above them, possibly older than Eduardo's tenure on the property. The wood was a dark reddish color where it was visible, tight-grained, the kind of timber that doesn't grow in California anymore because the trees that produced it haven't grown here for 100 years. She straightened up and looked around the covered section again with different eyes. Diego had appeared in the gate, his hands still correctly clasped behind his back. "Mom, can I come in?" "Come in carefully. Watch the floor." He entered with the exaggerated caution he applied to things he'd been told to be careful about, testing each step before committing his weight, which on a 7-year-old made very little practical difference, but was deeply earnest. "It smells like Grandpa," he said. Maya turned to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the covered section, head slightly tilted, face doing something small and private. She said yes. He said, "I like it." She didn't answer that. She went back to looking at the floor. She found the first anomaly along the north wall. She almost didn't find it at all, because it was subtle, the kind of thing you only notice if you are looking for irregularity in a structure you've already decided is regular. Along the base of the north wall, at the junction where the wall met the floor beams, there was a seam. Not the seam of the wire itself, which ran in a pattern she'd already mapped, but a seam in the floor construction, a line where the substrate on top of the wire was slightly different in color and texture from the substrate on either side of it. The difference was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing that would read as variation in accumulated organic matter, which was exactly what it looked like, except that the line was too straight. Organic accumulation doesn't accumulate in straight lines. Maya stood over it and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the beams. She thought about the mortise and tenon joints. She thought about her father, who had built very little in his life with his own hands, who had bought the farm already built and had maintained it and repaired it, but had not, to her knowledge, been the kind of craftsman who would lay a 2x6 to a measurement and cut a mortise joint and fit it with the care she was looking at in this floor. Which meant someone else had built this. And whoever had built it to last, and had built it to look like something ordinary. She didn't say any of this to her children. She said it only in her own head, in the provisional, careful language she used when she was not yet ready to trust a thought enough to give it words out loud. Lily appeared in the gate behind Diego. She looked at the space with the appraising eye she'd developed in the past year, which was the eye of someone who has been paying attention to what things cost, and what they provide, and whether the exchange makes sense. "We're sleeping here? We're sleeping in the car tonight. Tomorrow we figure out how to make this work." Lily looked at the covered section, looked at the floor, looked at the wall, did the same assessment Maya had done, arriving at different conclusions because she was 11 and her experience of what could be fixed with effort and what could not was still being established. "It's got a roof," Lily said. "Yeah, that's something." "Yeah." Diego sat down on the floor of the covered section, cross-legged in the middle, with complete confidence in his own judgment about where it was safe to sit. "I'm naming that one Eduardo," he said, pointing at a gap in the south wire where nothing was currently visible. Maya said, "There aren't any chickens, bud." Diego considered this. "Not yet," he said. Maya allowed herself, briefly and privately, to feel the weight of what she was standing in. Not the weight of the dirt and the wire and the rod at the base posts, but the other weight. The weight of being 43 hours past her father's funeral and standing in the least valuable thing he'd left behind, in the corner of a property that her siblings had divided with the precision of people who were very sure they knew what mattered, in a structure that her brother had described as a gesture of inclusion. She felt it, and then she put it somewhere manageable and looked at the floor again. The seam along the north wall was approximately 6 feet long. It terminated at either end at the structural crossbeams, which meant, she thought, that it was not a seam in the accumulated matter but a seam in the floor panels themselves, which meant that one or more of the wire panels in that section could be lifted. She was not ready to test this today. She was standing in a structure she didn't yet understand, with her children present, without tools, without any clear idea of what she was looking at or whether it mattered. But she noted it. She filed it. She went to the car and got the cooler and the box of food she'd packed, and she set up their first meal in the shadow of the chicken run on a blanket on the ground, peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices, and the last of the juice boxes. And the three of them sat in the late afternoon sun with the almond grove visible to the north and the dry creek bed glinting faintly to the east, and the valley spreading out in every direction with its particular flat and patient beauty, and they ate. Diego said, "I think Grandpa loved this place." Maya said, "I think he did." Lily said, "Why did he give us the worst part?" Maya looked at her daughter. Lily was not being cruel. She was asking a genuine question in the direct way she asked genuine questions. "I don't know," Maya said. "Maybe he thought Richard and Sandra needed more. Maybe he didn't think about it that much. Maybe he figured I could make something out of what I had." Lily thought about this. "Do you think you can?" Maya looked at the covered section of the chicken run, at the old red-tinted beams visible at the corner where the wire had pulled back, at the straight line she'd noticed along the north wall. "I think this place might be more than it looks," she said. Lily followed her gaze. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet." This was honest. She was not the kind of person who stated things she didn't yet know as though she did. She had spent too many years on the wrong end of confident predictions to be comfortable with them. What she had was a feeling that was specific rather than general, a feeling that was rooted in the evidence of the beams and the joints and the seam, and not in the desperate hope of a person with $314 in her account and nowhere else to go. Though she was also that person. She did not pretend otherwise. After the kids were asleep in the car, Lily in the back seat with her book and Diego curled around his armadillo on the front passenger seat reclined as far as it would go, Maya went back to the covered section alone with her phone flashlight. The October night was cold enough to matter, and her breath came out visible in the light as she walked the floor carefully, following the seam. She had a pocket knife. She used the blade to scrape gently at the edge of the seam, and the accumulated matter came away in small compressed crumbles that smelled of earth and old organic matter and time. Beneath it, where she cleared a small section, was wire. And at the edge of the wire panel, where it met its neighbor, there was a mechanism. She leaned down close with her flashlight. A latch. Simple, heavy iron, the kind of hardware that predated everything made of aluminum and plastic and engineered efficiency. The kind of hardware that someone made by hand or had custom fabricated, in an era when those were the same thing. It was coated with the same compressed matter as everything else, almost entirely invisible unless you were looking for exactly this. She sat back on her heels in the dark of the chicken run and held her phone light steady and looked at the latch and thought about several things at once. She thought about her father, who had farmed this land for 31 years and never once mentioned to her that the floor of the chicken run had a latch built into it. Whether he had known and chosen not to say. Whether he had not known because he had bought the property from someone else who also had not said, and this thing had been here in the dark under 30 years of chickens and accumulated organic matter, waiting. She thought about Richard saying the chicken run had been specifically designated for Maya, in a will that Richard had drawn up himself. She thought about how specifically it had been designated, that it was not the quarter-acre she had inherited, but the chicken run itself, and the language in the will had been particular about this, had named the structure rather than just the land, which she had read as legal precision but now wondered about. She thought about the beams, about the craftsmanship, about the way old expensive work is always recognizable under later layers of ordinary neglect. She did not open the latch. Not tonight. Not alone in the dark with her children sleeping in a car 20 feet away and no one who knew where she was and no understanding of what she was looking at. She took photographs of the latch with her phone. She took photographs of the seam. She took photographs of the beams at the corner where they were visible, and she took a photograph of the mortise joint, close enough that the grain and the cut were legible. Then she went back to the car. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine and looked at the photographs she'd taken. She looked at them for a long time. The valley was quiet in the way that agricultural valleys are quiet at night, which is not silent, but is a silence made of the sounds of wind in dry vegetation and the distant movement of water in irrigation channels, and occasionally the sound of something living doing what living things do in the dark. She could see a fragment of the almond grove in the moonlight, the trees standing in their rows with their bare limbs. She thought about what her father had left her. Not the quarter-acre. Not the gesture of inclusion that her brother had described. The specific thing. The chicken run with its latched floor and its red-tinted beams and its careful construction that predated Eduardo by decades, possibly by generations. The thing that her siblings had appraised at nothing and divided from the rest without ceremony. She thought about what was under the floor. She did not know. She told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that she did not know, that a latch could mean anything, that old buildings had old hardware in them for reasons that were often prosaic and disappointing. But the feeling she had was not the feeling of someone who has found an interesting architectural feature. It was a different feeling. The feeling of a person standing at the edge of a locked door in the dark, uncertain what is on the other side, but certain, in the wordless way that certain things make themselves known, that the door matters. She set her phone face down on the passenger seat. She looked at the chicken run through the windshield. The moonlight made the wire glow faintly, the way wire does when light catches it at the right angle, and the covered section was a dark rectangle within the larger structure, its tin roof flat and unreflective, its contents invisible from outside. In the morning, she would need water and food and a plan for where the children would go to school and a basic inventory of what the structure needed to be habitable. She would need to call the county assessor and understand what property taxes she owed and when they were due. She would need to think practically about winter, which was 6 weeks away and which in the valley was not severe, but was not something to be cavalier about, not with children, not without heat. All of this was real and pressing and true. And underneath all of it, like the beams beneath the wire, like the latch beneath the accumulated matter of 30 years, was the question she would be sleeping with tonight and waking with tomorrow morning. What did Eduardo Torres know about the floor of his chicken run? And what, if anything, did Richard? Diego said something in his sleep. She turned to look at him. He was curled into himself with the compact thoroughness of sleeping children, his face entirely relaxed in a way it wasn't when he was awake, and tracking everything around him with the attentiveness of a child who has learned that things change without warning. She watched him breathe. She thought about what Lily had asked. Why did he give us the worst part? She looked at the chicken run in the moonlight. Maybe, she thought. Maybe he didn't. She leaned her seat back as far as it would go and pulled her jacket up around her shoulders and closed her eyes. She would find out in the morning what was under the floor of the worst part of Eduardo Torres's estate. She would find out what he had left her. And nothing that came after, not the thing under the floor or the people who would come when they found out about the thing under the floor, none of it would be anything she could have predicted lying there in the front seat of her Corolla in the moonlit quiet of the valley with her children sleeping around her and the almond trees standing patient in the dark. But she would handle it, because handling things was what she had always done, and because somewhere under the exhaustion and the grief and the $314 in her checking account, she was her father's daughter, and Eduardo Torres had spent 31 years working land that gave what it could when you were willing to look at it. Honestly and stay. She had stayed. She would look. She slept. She woke before Diego did, which almost never happened, and for a moment she lay in the reclined driver's seat listening to the valley coming to life around her without knowing why the quality of her wakefulness was different from the ordinary kind. Then she remembered the latch, and her body was alert before she'd finished the thought. The morning was cold and very clear. The light in the east was the color of pale ash just beginning to warm, and the almond trees threw long shadows west across the ground that had not yet softened into day. She could see her breath. She sat up carefully and looked at Diego, still sleeping with his armadillo, and Lily, who had her book open on her chest and her eyes closed, and who Maya suspected had read until 2 in the morning by phone flashlight, and then fallen asleep with the evidence still in her hands. She left them both. She walked to the covered section of the chicken run in the early light with her pocket knife and her phone, and no plan beyond looking at the thing she'd found last night in a context where she could trust her own perception. Exhaustion and darkness and grief do strange things to perception. She needed to see it in daylight and be sure. The latch was real. She crouched over it in the gray morning light and cleared more of the accumulated matter away with the flat of the knife blade, working slowly and carefully along the seam she'd identified the night before. The panel was approximately 4 feet by 3 feet, consistent with the spacing of the structural beams she'd observed. The latch was on the north edge, a pivot mechanism in wrought iron, the kind of hardware that was designed to be operated with a single finger if you knew where it was, and to be invisible if you didn't. She knew where it was. She looked at it for a moment longer. She thought about calling Richard. She thought about calling Sandra. She thought about calling a lawyer, except that she didn't have one, and getting one would cost money she didn't have, and besides, she was standing in a structure that had been specifically designated for her in a legal document, and whatever was in this floor was hers until someone proved otherwise. She pressed the latch with her thumb. It moved. Stiffly, with the resistance of metal that has not moved in a very long time. But it moved, and she heard the click of it releasing, and the panel shifted fractionally upward on its north edge, which told her there was a spring mechanism helping it, which told her that whoever built this had wanted it to be possible to open from the surface without a lot of effort, which told her it had been opened and closed before. She got her fingers under the north edge of the panel and lifted. The panel swung on a hinge along its south edge, smooth despite the decades. The hinge mechanism apparently protected from corrosion by the accumulated matter above it, and by whatever they had used to treat it before they closed it. The panel lifted to vertical, and Maya found the hook that held it there. A simple iron hook on a bracket mounted to the underside of the panel, designed to catch on a small bar welded to the south beam. She looked down into the opening. It was dark below, and she shone her phone light into it, and what she saw was a ladder. Not a gap in the earth. Not a crude hole. A ladder, made of the same dark reddish timber as the beams above, the rungs fitted into the side rails with mortise and tenon joints that matched everything else in the construction. The ladder descended approximately 8 feet to a surface below, and even in the phone light, she could see that the surface below was not earth. It was a floor. She did not go down immediately. She sat back on her heels and breathed, and took several photographs, and then sat with the photographs and looked at them and made sure she was understanding what she was seeing. A ladder leading down to a floor. A deliberately constructed access point. A hinge mechanism maintained by design. This was not a root cellar that someone had put a wire floor over and then forgotten. This was a concealment. A space made to be hidden and to stay hidden for as long as the surface above it remained intact. She went back to the car. She woke Lily first, gently, and watched her daughter's eyes focus from sleep into the particular attentiveness she had when she was being told something that required real processing. "I need you to stay with Diego until I call you," Maya said. "I found something in the floor of the covered section. I'm going down to look at it. I'll be 8 or 10 feet below ground, so you won't be able to hear me unless you come to the opening. If I call you, come. If you hear anything that sounds wrong, come." Lily looked at her. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet. That's why I'm going to look. Should we come now?" "No. Wait here." Lily sat up. Her expression was the one she used when she disagreed with a decision but was going to respect it. "Okay." Maya went back to the covered section. She sat at the edge of the opening, and she put her phone between her teeth, and she set her feet on the first rung of the ladder, and she went down. The ladder was solid. Each rung held her weight without flex. The craftsmanship was consistent all the way down, which she found almost as disorienting as anything else, because the consistency implied care, and care implied intention, and intention implied someone who had thought very carefully about how long this needed to last, and had built accordingly. Her feet touched the floor at 8 feet down, and she stood and turned around and shone her phone light into the space and said nothing, because there were no words immediately available that matched what she was seeing. The chamber was approximately 20 feet by 30 feet. The ceiling was the underside of the wire floor above her, the beams visible from this angle as the ribcage of the structure. The walls were stone, dry-stacked fieldstone of the kind found in this part of the valley, fitted with a precision that had prevented any significant collapse over however many years this space had been here. The floor was hard-packed earth, dry as bone, the kind of dryness that comes from a space that has been sealed and stable for a very long time. Along the three walls that she could see, north, east, and west, were wooden crates. Not boxes, crates. The kind of substantial wooden crate that was used to ship things requiring protection, built of inch-thick boards and reinforced at the corners with iron brackets, sealed with lids that had been fitted, and then, she saw as she moved closer, wrapped in a material she initially took for burlap, but which proved, when she touched it, to be something more durable, a heavy waxed linen that had been applied in layers and had kept its integrity. She counted the crates along the north wall. 11, stacked too high in some places, single height in others, arranged with the efficiency of someone who had thought carefully about the space they were filling. She counted the east wall. 9 crates, similarly arranged. She turned to the west wall. There were no crates on the west wall. Instead, against the west wall, there were 4 objects that were not crates. They were cylinders, each approximately 4 feet tall and 18 inches in diameter, standing upright on wooden bases, wrapped in the same heavy waxed linen. They had the look of something transported with extreme care, each one individually wrapped, and then overwrapped, and then the whole assembly secured with iron bands at intervals that suggested the person doing the securing had been very precise about not wanting these things to shift. And in the center of the west wall, between the cylinders, was a wooden cabinet. Not a crate. A cabinet, low and wide, with a door that was latched with a mechanism matching the one above on the wire panel. Sitting on top of the cabinet was an object wrapped in what had been silk and was now a fragile, stiffened ghost of silk, still legible as the form it had once taken. Maya stood in the center of the chamber with her phone light and turned slowly and said nothing for a long time. Then she turned around and went back up the ladder. Lily was standing at the wire gate of the covered section with Diego beside her, which was not what Maya had said, but which she understood entirely. "Come down," Maya said. "I need you to see this." She carried Diego down the ladder, one arm around him and one hand on the rungs, 7 years old and 38 pounds of trust that she would not drop him. Lily came down on her own, carefully, the way she did things. They stood in the chamber together in the phone light. Diego looked at the crates with the wide-eyed pragmatism of a child who has not yet developed a framework for understanding that some things shouldn't be possible. "There's a lot of boxes," he said. "Yeah," Maya said. "What's in them?" "I don't know yet." "Can we open them?" "Not yet. I need to find out some things first." Lily was looking at the cabinet in the center of the west wall. Her voice was very careful. "Mom, look at the top." Maya had already looked at the silk-wrapped object on top of the cabinet. But she hadn't looked at what was propped against it, which was a rectangular envelope, sealed with wax, addressed in fountain pen in a handwriting that was meticulous and small. The envelope was addressed to whoever tends this land when it is time. The Japanese characters beneath the English were ones she couldn't read. She picked up the envelope with a steadiness she didn't feel. The wax seal was intact, cream-colored, pressed with a design that when she looked at it closely was the shape of an almond tree in flower. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at her children, and then she carefully, without breaking the wax, slid the envelope into her jacket pocket. Lily said, "Is that a letter?" "Yes." "Who wrote it?" "I don't know yet." Diego had walked to the nearest crate and was pressing his palms against the wood in a gesture that was exploratory rather than forceful. He said, "They're really solid. Don't push on them. I'm just feeling them." He removed his hands and looked at them as if they might have learned something. "They're heavy." "Yes." "How heavy?" "Very." Diego thought about this with the seriousness he brought to physics. "Must be something heavy inside." Maya looked at the crates. She thought about the math that a person does when they are standing in front of something they cannot yet allow themselves to calculate. 20 crates of approximately that size and construction, sealed and wrapped, and stored in a chamber that had been built by someone who understood how to keep things for a very long time. She did not do the math. Not yet. She allowed herself only the edge of it, the shape of the number without the number itself. She got the children back up the ladder. She closed the panel and resettled the latch and put the accumulated matter back as best she could across the surface of the seam. Then she stood and looked at the floor for a moment, and then she walked out of the covered section, and she found a patch of dry grass in the October sun, and she sat down in it, and she took the letter out of her jacket pocket. She opened it carefully, pressing the flap back without breaking the wax seal, so that the seal remained attached to the envelope rather than falling away. Inside was a single folded page and a second smaller envelope, sealed, with the word for the authorities written on the front in the same careful hand. She read the page. The writing was in English, formal and precise. The English of someone for whom it was not a first language, but who had spent a great deal of time making it exact. The date at the top was February 14th, 1942. My name is Kenji Tanaka. I was born in Fresno, California, in 1901. My father Ichiro Tanaka came to this valley in 1893. He farmed 47 acres in Tulare County, which he purchased from the Sutter Land Company in 1899 after 10 years of labor and saving. He planted almonds and stone fruit and kept the land as a thing worth keeping. I am writing this letter because the President of the United States has signed an executive order that will require my family to leave this property within 60 days. We will be permitted to bring only what we can carry. The rest of what we have built here over 50 years will be left behind. My father died in 1938. My mother in 1940. I have farmed this land for 20 years with my wife Haruko and my sons Takashi and Ichiro II, who is named for his grandfather. We have done nothing that would justify what is being asked of us. I am not a naive man. I understand that this order will not be rescinded because we comply with it graciously, and it may not be rescinded at all. I understand that people who want our land have been watching for an opportunity of this kind for a long time. I understand that when we leave, the possibility that we will return to find it as we left it is not a certainty. So I am doing what my father taught me to do with things worth keeping. The chamber beneath the hen house was built by my father in 1904. He built it originally as a root cellar, then as a place to keep the things he valued most from a country where he had seen that valued things could be taken very quickly by people who decided to take them. He was not wrong to be cautious. In the chamber you will find 32 crates containing objects of value. I am placing in this letter a manifest of those crates and their contents, so that whoever finds this knows what is here and what it is worth and to whom it belongs. The land belongs to my family. If my family does not return, then it belongs to the first honest person who finds this letter and is willing to do what it asks. What it asks is simple. Read the second envelope. Do what it says. The rest is yours. I am not a religious man, but I believe in the weight of honest work, and I believe that 50 years of almond trees and stone fruit and careful building do not vanish because a frightened government says they do. My father is in this soil. My sons were born in the house on this land. My wife planted the marigold along the east fence that I expect is still there or has seeded itself elsewhere, because marigold is stubborn the way honest people are stubborn. If you are the person who is reading this, I trust you. I don't know why, but I do. The letter itself will tell you. If you are not the person who should have found this, then you know it, and I ask you to put this back and wait. Kenji Tanaka, February 14th, 1942. Maya read the letter 3 times. She read it the first time with her eyes, and the second time with her understanding, and the third time with the part of her that was still her father's daughter, sitting in the dirt he had farmed for 31 years, which was also the dirt Ichiro Tanaka had bought in 1899, which was also the dirt that Kenji Tanaka had buried his life's work beneath on a February morning in 1942 because a frightened government had signed a piece of paper and called it law. She opened the second envelope. Inside was a list of names. 7 names, with addresses as of 1942 and a note beneath them in Kenji's handwriting that said these are the families who borrowed from us and did not have time to repay before we were taken. If any of them or their children can be found, give them what they are owed. The amounts are listed beside each name. Below the list was a paragraph. There is also the matter of the 47 acres. The deed in my father's name is in the cabinet in the chamber, along with the tax records and the bill of sale from the Sutter Land Company and my father's correspondence with the county assessor over 40 years. These prove our ownership. I do not know what the government will say happened to the land after we were taken, or who will have been allowed to claim it. But the record is here, and records are stubborn the same way marigold is stubborn. I am sorry that you have to carry this. I am grateful that someone will. Maya sat in the dry grass for a long time after she finished reading. The sun had come up enough to warm her back, and the almond trees cast their shadows differently now, shorter and more direct. She could hear Diego and Lily somewhere beyond the equipment pad, Diego's voice asking questions about something and Lily's answering in the patient tone she used when she was trying to explain something that she had only recently figured out herself. She thought about Tanaka putting his family's life into a hole in the ground and sealing it, and walking away from it on a February morning in 1942. She thought about Eduardo Torres buying this land from someone who either knew or didn't know what was beneath the floor of the hen house, and farming it for 31 years above it. She thought about her brother Richard drawing up a will and making sure the chicken run specifically, the structure itself, passed to Maya, and she thought about the question that raised, which was whether Richard had also found the latch at some point and decided, for reasons she could not yet fully see, that he did not want to be the one who opened it. She put the letters back in their envelopes. She put the envelopes in her jacket pocket. She looked at the chicken run. Then she took out her phone and called the one person she could think of who knew how to handle something she couldn't measure. Her name was Veronica Salinas, and she was an estate attorney in Visalia, who Maya had met at the care facility 2 years ago when Veronica's mother was a resident there, and they had talked occasionally in the hallways in the way that people talk when they are both waiting for difficult things to be over, and Veronica had given Maya her card and said, "Call me if you ever need anything," the way people say it, which usually means nothing, but which Maya had kept the card for anyway because she had learned to save the phone numbers of competent people against the day she needed them. She called at 8:15 in the morning. Veronica answered on the third ring. Maya said, "I know it's early, and I know this is going to sound like something it isn't, but I need to describe something to you, and I need you to tell me what I'm looking at legally. I inherited a piece of property. There's a chamber under the floor. In the chamber, there are crates, and there's a letter from the original owner of the land from 1942, and the letter says the land and its contents belong to whoever finds it honestly. I need to know what that means." There was a pause. Then Veronica said, "Are you on the property now?" "Yes." "Don't move anything. Don't open anything. Don't let anyone into the structure. I'll be there by noon." She was there by 11:40. She came in a sensible gray sedan and got out wearing field clothes rather than the professional attire Maya had only ever seen her in, which was a choice that communicated she had understood this was going to require something other than office work. She was 41, compact, with the particular manner of a person who processes information quickly and is comfortable sitting with it before she speaks. She read the letters in the covered section with her phone light, standing rather than sitting, the letters held steady in her hands. Then she read them again. Then she said, "Show me the chamber." She descended the ladder. She stood in the chamber with her phone and was quiet for a very long time, turning slowly, counting the crates the way Maya had counted them, letting her eyes go to the cylinders and the cabinet and back to the crates. She said, "Do you have any idea what's in these?" Maya said, "I have a letter with a manifest." Veronica turned. "Where?" "Folded in the main letter." Maya produced it. She had not unfolded it yet. She did not know why she had waited, only that she had wanted another person present when she read it, someone who could receive the information alongside her and not merely receive it secondhand. They unfolded the manifest together. It was 2 pages, both sides, written in the same careful hand in columns with headings. Crate number, contents, quantity, estimated value as of 1941. Notes. Maya read the first line. Gold coin, United States Double Eagle, 1849 to 1933. 212 pieces. Estimated value per piece as of 1941, $34. Notes. These are the saving of Ichiro Tanaka, 1893 to 1938, and Kenji Tanaka, 1938 to 1942. Selected for quality and condition. She read the second line. Gold coin, United States Liberty Head, various dates 1850 to 1907. 188 pieces. Estimated value per piece as of 1941, $20. Notes. Acquired through trade and labor payment over 50 years. The third line. Gold bullion, refined, in bar form. 40 bars. Weight per bar, approximately 400 troy ounces. Estimated value per bar as of 1941, $480. Notes. refined from placer gold taken from the creek bed on the eastern boundary of the property 1893 to 1915. She stopped reading. She looked at Veronica. Veronica was looking at the manifest with an expression that was entirely controlled and yet was doing something around the edges that Maya recognized as the expression of someone working very hard to keep their professional composure in contact with a number that resisted professional composure. "Keep reading," Veronica said. The remaining items on the manifest included, in addition to the coins and bullion, for bronze cylinder pieces that the manifest described as Japanese bronze temple drums, 18th century, from Kenji's mother's family, brought to California in 1893 and estimated in 1941 at values that even 40 years before the current collector's market would translate into something staggering. Ceramic pieces of specific dynasties that Kenji had listed by kiln name and date. Documents including the original deed, the tax records, 40 years of correspondence with the county assessor, and a signed affidavit from the Sutherland Company confirming the legitimacy of Ichiro Tanaka's purchase. And at the bottom of the second page, in a slightly different ink, as if added later or with a different pen, a single line. There is also the marigold jar on the cabinet top. "This is not for selling. This is for whoever finds it." Veronica said, quietly, "I need to make some calls. This is beyond real estate law. This is property law and historical assets and possibly Japanese-American reparations law, and I want to be absolutely certain of your position before anything else happens." She paused. "Maya, do you understand what this is?" Maya looked at the crates. She looked at the cylinders. She thought about Kenji Tanaka's handwriting, steady and precise on a February morning in 1942. "It's someone's life," she said. "It's also," Veronica said carefully, "one of the largest undiscovered private asset caches I have ever heard of, and I want to make sure it stays yours." She climbed back up the ladder and made calls from the covered section for 40 minutes, pacing the length of the structure, her voice low and deliberate. Maya sat on the ground outside with the children, and they ate the granola bars she'd found in the bottom of the cooler, and they watched the valley do what the valley does in the morning, which is to just be itself, immense and flat and full of light. Diego said, "Veronica talks a lot. She's solving a problem." "What problem?" Maya looked at him. She said, "She's trying to make sure that the things in the chamber stay with us instead of going to someone else." Diego thought about this. "Like how you always make sure the leftovers are in the right container. Something like that." He nodded as if this was entirely reasonable and went back to his granola bar. The appraiser arrived 2 days later. Veronica had arranged him, a man named Charles Adeyemi who drove from Los Angeles, and who was credentialed by 3 separate professional bodies, and who had spent 30 years handling the authentication of assets in estate and insurance contexts. He came with an assistant who carried equipment in cases that looked designed for delicate work and handled things with the caution of someone who understood that the difference between proper handling and improper handling could be measured in very large numbers. He descended the ladder and was silent in the chamber for a long time. Then he began to work. He worked for 6 hours the first day, opening crates with tools that removed the lids without damaging the contents, cataloging items in a method that Maya watched and did not interrupt. He was methodical in the way that expert people are methodical, which is to say he did not perform his expertise, but simply applied it, each movement purposeful and complete. At 4 in the afternoon, he came up from the chamber and sat on a wooden crate that Maya had found in the equipment shed, and he looked at his notes for several minutes before he spoke. "The coins," he said, "need individual authentication, which will take time. But I can tell you from a preliminary visual inspection that the Double Eagle collection is exceptional. 212 pieces of that date range in what appears to be that condition represents something I have not personally encountered in a single collection in 30 years. The face value is negligible. The numismatic value is not. A single high-grade Double Eagle from certain years in that range sells at auction for anywhere from $12,000 to over $2 million, depending on the date and mint mark. We are not talking about a uniform valuation. We are talking about a collection that will require individual assessment for each coin." He paused. "The bullion is straightforward. 40 bars at 400 troy ounces each is 16,000 troy ounces. At current spot price, you are looking at approximately $48 million in gold weight alone, subject to assay confirmation. The bars appear to be high purity based on preliminary assessment." He paused again. The bronze drums require a specialist I will need to bring in, but if they are what they appear to be, which is 18th century temple drums from the Edo period, authenticated examples have sold in the range of $8 to $20 million each. There are 4 of them. Maya was sitting on the ground with her back against the north wall of the covered section. She was aware that her hands were very still on her knees. The ceramics, Adeyemi continued, are similarly beyond my area of primary expertise, but the pieces I was able to identify from the manifest description include items from kilns and periods that represent some of the most valuable ceramics in the world. 3 of the pieces, if authenticated, would individually qualify for major auction house inclusion. He stopped. She said, "Can you give me a total?" He looked at his notes again. Then he looked at her. "It would be premature and irresponsible to give you a confirmed total at this stage. Authentication takes time, and the variation in numismatic valuation alone could shift the number by tens of millions of dollars in either direction." "I understand that," Maya said. "I'm asking for a preliminary range." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Preliminary and subject to significant revision in either direction. In the range of $280 million to $330 million. Maya did not respond for what felt like a long time. She looked at the covered section of the chicken run, at the wire walls and the rotted base posts and the concave tin roof, at the structure her siblings had appraised as the worst part of their father's estate and arranged, by a legal document Richard had drawn up himself, to pass to the family member they considered least capable of knowing what to do with it. Veronica, who was standing against the east wall with her phone in her hand, said nothing. She had been quiet since Adeyemi started his preliminary summary, and she remained quiet now, watching Maya with the attention of someone who understands that the moment a person is in is one that requires room. Lily was sitting just outside the covered section gate. Maya could see her through the wire. Her daughter was looking at her with an expression that was trying to be composed and was not quite managing it. Diego was asleep in the car. Maya said, "The manifest mentions a debt list. 7 families. Veronica said, "Yes, I want to find those families. Whatever they're owed, adjusted for interest and time, I want to find them." Veronica nodded. "That's traceable. Not all of them may be findable, but we start trying." "And the deed. The original Tanaka deed. What does that mean for the property?" Veronica's expression became careful. "The land passed through several transactions after the Tanakas were interned. Your father purchased it in 1991 from a James Whitmore. James Whitmore purchased it in 1968 from a land company that had acquired it in 1942 through a tax forfeiture proceeding that, I can already tell you, involved irregularities that were common to that era and that have been the subject of legal action and reparations claims for decades. The Japanese American Citizens League has a legal framework specifically for this category of property. It does not mean the Tanaka family has a current claim that supersedes your inheritance, because your father's title was clear and registered. But it means that there is a moral and possibly a legal obligation, and I think you already know what you want to do." Maya said, "I want to find the Tanaka family." "I thought you might. Is that possible?" Veronica said, "Kenji Tanaka was a real person. The land records exist. The interment records exist. Yes, it's possible. It will take time. Find them." Richard arrived on the 4th day. She had known he would. She had prepared for it not by rehearsing arguments, but by understanding exactly what she knew and what she could prove and what the legal situation was, which Veronica had explained to her in specific terms over 2 evenings at the folding table Maya had set up inside the covered section. The inheritance was hers. The structure and the quarter-acre had been designated specifically to her in a legally executed will. The contents of a chamber beneath the floor of an inherited structure were, under California property law, part of the property and therefore part of the inheritance. Veronica had found 2 prior cases with analogous fact patterns, different in detail but consistent in principle, and she was confident on the question of ownership. What she was less confident about was what Richard knew and when he had known it. He came in the afternoon, in the Mercedes that he drove to things requiring authority, and he parked at the edge of the gravel where the dirt track ended, and he got out and looked at the covered section and then at Maya, who was standing in the gate, and then at the cars that were also parked there, Veronica's gray sedan, Adeyemi's rented SUV, a pickup that belonged to a structural engineer named Pete Galvez who Maya had hired to assess the base posts, and who had arrived that morning and was currently under the covered section, making notes about what could be repaired and what needed replacement. Richard looked at all of this with an expression that started as confusion and arrived somewhere that was not quite concealment, but was close to it. He said, "You've made yourself at home." Maya said, "It's my property." He walked toward her. His suit was less precisely tailored than the funeral one, which meant this was an impromptu trip rather than a planned one, which meant someone had told him something and he'd come immediately. She looked at his shoes, and they were the wrong shoes for the dirt track, polished city shoes that had picked up dust on the walk from the car. He said, "I heard you had some people out here." She said, "Appraisers." Something shifted in his face. "Appraisers. Property has to be properly valued for estate purposes," Maya said. "You know that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have you found anything unusual?" She looked at him. She held the question up between them and looked at it. "Richard," she said, "did Dad ever say anything to you about the henhouse floor?" His face did the thing it did when he was composing an answer, a micro-stillness she'd recognized since childhood, the pause of a person reaching for the version of the truth that was most useful to them. He said, "Dad talked about the chickens. He never talked about the structure specifically." Maya said, "And you never looked at it yourself?" "In all the times you came out here to help manage the estate. I'm an attorney, not a contractor. I leave structural assessment to professionals." She let the silence sit between them for a moment. Then she said, "Veronica is here if you want to talk through the legal situation. I think that would be the most useful conversation." His expression changed then. More precisely, the composure of it changed, and what came through for just a moment was something that looked like calculation and also like something older, a brother looking at a sister across a farmyard. And behind that look was either genuine shock at what she'd found or genuine shock at having miscalculated how much she'd find, and she could not yet determine which. He said, "I'm not sure what there is to discuss." Veronica appeared at the gate of the covered section. She had been listening, which was fine, because listening was something she was very good at. She said, "Richard, I'm Veronica Salinas. I represent Maya in the estate matter. There are some documents you should see and a conversation we should have about the scope of what's been discovered and Maya's legal position with respect to it. Why don't you come inside?" Richard looked at the chicken run. He looked at the wire walls and the rotted posts and the concave tin roof. He looked at the covered section, which now contained a folding table and a chair and the box of supplies Maya had organized and the lamp she'd bought at the hardware store in Porterville that ran off a battery pack and which cast a clean white light across the space. He went in. What came out of that conversation, which lasted 2 hours, and which Maya sat through with the stillness of someone who is prepared for the terrain, even when the terrain is difficult, was clarification rather than resolution. Veronica laid out the legal position clearly and with documented evidence. The inheritance was valid. The contents were Maya's. The original Tanaka deed was a separate and complex matter that involved historical land seizure law and reparations frameworks, and was not going to be resolved in an afternoon in a chicken run. Richard said, in his most measured attorney's voice, that he believed the estate should be reconsidered given the discovery of assets that Eduardo could not have properly valued when he drew up the will, and that assets of this magnitude required a different kind of distribution than personal property, and that he would be consulting his own legal counsel. Veronica said that he was welcome to do so. She said that the will was executed properly and filed with the county, and that challenges to it would need to proceed through probate court, and that she was confident in the outcome, but entirely prepared to defend it. He left before dark. Maya stood at the wire gate and watched the Mercedes move back down the dirt track through the almond grove, picking up dust as it went, and she thought about her father, who had farmed this land for 31 years and who had, for some reason that she would never entirely know, decided that the hen house should go to his youngest daughter. Pete Galvez came out of the covered section wiping his hands on his work pants and said the base posts were reparable, all of them, and that the tin roof needed replacement in 2 sections but was sound in the rest, and that the wire was salvageable in the east and north walls and needed full replacement on the south wall. The chamber structure below was solid, he said, stone construction of exceptional quality, no evidence of water intrusion, no structural compromise that he could see. She said, "How much to do the repairs?" He said, "For the frame and the roof, probably $7,000 in materials and another 4 in labor if I do it myself, and we're not in a hurry." She said she would call him in the morning. That evening, After the children were in their sleeping bags in the covered section, which was where they were sleeping now, on inflatable pads Maya had bought in Porterville, Diego having declared it better than camping because it had more walls, she sat outside in the dry grass with the marigold jar in her hands. She had brought it up from the chamber that afternoon, the last thing she'd retrieved before Adeyemi closed his catalog for the day. The silk wrapping had come away in pieces, fragile as old paper, the kind of fragile that means a thing has lasted exactly as long as it was supposed to and no longer. Inside was a ceramic jar, small enough to hold in 2 hands, blue and white, the kind of simple domestic ceramics that had been made in Japan for hundreds of years. It was not, she thought, the most valuable object in the chamber. The manifest hadn't even listed it among the assets. The lid came off carefully. Inside was earth, not the dry packed earth of the chamber floor. Garden soil, dark and different, the kind of soil that has been worked and composted and tended. Dry now, after 80 years, but still carrying the color and density of something that had been alive. And nestled in the soil, dry and pale but legible, was a seed. A single seed. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the east fence line, where in the last afternoon light she could see, because she had been looking for it since she read the letter, a line of plants along the wire that were not grass and not weeds, but something that had persisted and seeded itself for 80 years in the way that stubborn things do. Marigold. Still there. Still yellow. She closed the lid of the jar gently and held it in her hands in the dark and thought about a man on a February morning in 1942 who had put his father's savings and his family's art and his land's legal record into a hole in the ground, and then put one more thing in, a jar of earth from the garden his mother had planted and a seed from the flower that grew in it, because he believed that the next honest person who found what he'd buried would understand what he meant by it. She understood. She set the jar on the ground beside her and looked up at the valley sky, which was very full of stars in the way that rural California skies are full of stars when the moon is down and the irrigation districts have gone quiet for the night. She thought about what she was going to do. The legal process would take the time it took. Veronica was handling it. The appraisal would take the time it took. Adeyemi was handling it. Richard would file whatever he was going to file, and Veronica would respond, and eventually the court would say what the court said, and she would handle that when it came. But there were things she could affect now, today, without lawyers or appraisers or courts. She could find the Tanaka family. She got out her phone, and she began. The research took 3 days and the help of 2 librarians. One at the Porterville Public Library who had a specialty in Central Valley Japanese American history, and one she found through the Japanese American Citizens League who had been doing this work for 20 years and who, when Maya described what she had found and read her Kenji Tanaka's letter over the phone, was quiet for a long moment before she said, "I need to come and see this." Her name was Susan Mori, and she drove from Sacramento. She was 63, a third-generation Japanese American whose own grandparents had been interned in the same wave of executive orders that took the Tanaka family, and she came not as an official, but as a person who had spent her career following threads exactly like this one, and who understood, when she descended the ladder and stood in the chamber, what she was standing in with a depth of context that made Maya's own understanding look preliminary. Susan stood at the cabinet and looked at the deed. She read the manifest. She read Kenji's letter. She looked at the drums and the ceramics and the coins. And then she sat down on the floor of the chamber, which she did with the unself-consciousness of someone who is not performing being moved, but simply is moved, and she stayed there for a while. When she came back up, she said, Kenji Tanaka had one son who survived the internment. Takashi. He settled in San Jose after the war and never came back to Tulare County. Takashi had 2 daughters. One of them is still alive. Her name is Ruth Tanaka Marchetti, and she is 81 years old, and she lives in Santa Cruz. Maya looked at her. She asked the question with her eyes rather than her voice. Susan said, "She doesn't know about any of this. The family has known for decades that the land was gone. The circumstances of how it was taken were documented in reparations claims filed in the 1980s and never fully resolved. Ruth's mother tried to reclaim it twice in the 1950s and was denied both times on procedural grounds that are now widely understood to have been legally inadequate. Ruth herself filed a claim in 1987 that was settled for a nominal amount that everyone involved understood to be insufficient." Maya said, "I want to call her." Susan said, "Yes. I thought you might." The call happened the next morning from the covered section of the chicken run, which was becoming the center of operations in a way that Maya had not planned, but which made a kind of sense. Everything happening from the place where the thing had been found, where the letters had been written and sealed and waited. Ruth Tanaka Marchetti answered the phone on the second ring. She was 81 and her voice was clear and direct and entirely unprepared for what Maya said to her, which was, "My name is Maya Torres. I am calling from your grandfather's property in Tulare County, and I have found a letter from your grandfather Kenji Tanaka written on February 14th, 1942, and I need to read it to you." There was silence on the line for long. Enough that Maya said, "Mrs. Marchetti, are you there?" Ruth said, in a voice that had changed, "I'm here. Please go on." Maya read Kenji's letter to her. All of it. She read it without stopping, and when she finished, the silence on the line was different from the earlier one, the silence of something having shifted rather than the silence of waiting for something to happen. Ruth said, "My father never talked about the land. He couldn't. My grandmother couldn't say the word Tulare for the rest of her life. She'd start to say it and stop." Maya said, "Your grandfather left a manifest of everything in the chamber. He left a letter with a list of families who were owed money. And he left a deed. Your family's deed to this land." Ruth was quiet again. Maya said, "I want to be honest with you about the legal situation. I inherited this property from my father, who bought it legitimately in 1991. My inheritance is valid, and I have counsel who will defend it. But I want you to know that everything your grandfather left in that chamber was left for your family, and I intend to find a way to honor that regardless of what the law does or doesn't require." Ruth said, "Why?" Maya looked at the wire walls and the October sky beyond them and the almond trees standing in their rows. "Because your grandfather trusted someone he didn't know," she said, "and I think he deserved to have that trust honored." Another silence. Then Ruth said, "My grandmother always believed someone would find it. She used to say the land remembers. My father thought it was grief talking, but she was right." Maya said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Your grandfather mentioned a Mara gold jar. He said it wasn't for selling. He said it was for whoever found it. But I think maybe he meant it for you." Ruth's breath on the phone was audible. She said, "My grandmother's name was Haruko. It means spring fragrance. She grew marigolds along the east fence because her mother had taught her that they kept the soil warm. She always said a garden that can winter over a marigold will winter over anything. She said this her whole life until she died." Maya said, "The marigolds are still there. Along the east fence. 80 years later. They're still there." Ruth Tanaka Marchetti was quiet for a long time after that, and Maya held the phone and waited, understanding that some silences are not empty, but full of something that takes time to move through. Ruth said, "I would like to see the land." Maya said, "Come whenever you're ready. The door is open." Diego appeared at the gate of the covered section. He had a stick and a question. "Mom, what is marigold?" "It's a flower. Yellow." "Is it here?" "Yes." He looked at the east fence, which was visible from where he stood, the wire running along the property line with the dry field on the other side, and at the base of the wire, the persistent orange-yellow of the flowers that had seeded themselves season after season for 8 decades. He said, "Can I go look?" "Yes," Maya said. "Be careful of the wire." He went, with his stick and his careful feet, to look at the flowers that Haruko Tanaka had planted in the soil of a farm she would not be allowed to keep, and which had grown back every year since without being asked. Veronica arrived in the afternoon with documents from the probate court. Richard had filed a challenge. The grounds were that Eduardo's documented cognitive decline in his final 2 years cast doubt on his legal competency when the will was executed, and that assets of this magnitude required equitable distribution among surviving heirs under principles of fairness and proportionality. Maya read the filing. She put it down on the folding table. She said, "When can we respond?" Veronica said, "I've already drafted the response." The will was executed 16 months before Eduardo entered the care facility. His attending physician has agreed to provide an affidavit about his cognition at the time of signing. The notary who witnessed the will is available to testify, and the specific language designating the chicken run structure, the precision of it, will be relevant because it is unusual enough to suggest Eduardo knew exactly what he was doing. Maya said, "Do you think he knew what was in the chamber?" Veronica said, "I think there's a possibility he knew there was something there, even if he didn't know its nature or its extent." The precision of the language in the will, specifying the structure rather than the land, is notable. Whether we ever know his reasoning is a different question. Maya thought about her father, about the Sunday phone calls, about his voice saying you're doing all right, Amija, about a man who had farmed 47 acres for 31 years above a chamber he may have known about and may have thought was the most valuable thing he had and may have decided, for reasons she would never entirely know, to leave to the child who would understand what value actually meant. She said, "Let's win this." Veronica said, "We will." That night, Maya walked the perimeter of the chicken run in the dark, the same perimeter she had walked on the first morning, but differently now, with a different understanding of what she was walking around. The base posts with their rot, the wire panels with their loose staples, the concave tin that would need to be replaced. All the things that made this structure look like the least of what Eduardo had left behind. She stopped at the north wall and put her palm flat against the wire and felt it, the cold of it, the regularity of the hexagonal mesh under her hand, the faint vibration of wind pressing through it from the east. Below this wall was the north wall of the chamber, Kenji Tanaka's dry-stacked fieldstone, the careful work of a man who believed in building things to last. She thought about what the appraiser had said, in the range of $280 million to $330 million. She stood in the dark with her hand on the wire and let that number exist in her, without trying to make it smaller or more manageable or more real than it was willing to be yet. Let it be what it was. The accumulated evidence of two families' work and faith, stored in the dark by one family and inherited by the other, connecting across 80 years through a latch that most people would not have noticed and would not have investigated and would not have found the patience to understand. She was not most people. She had $314 in her checking account when she drove into Tulare County with 2 children and a cooler and a cast iron pan. She had chosen the hard thing because the easy thing was not available to her. And in the process of choosing the hard thing, she had found not just the hard thing but the thing beneath it, the thing that the hard thing was sitting on top of, the thing that required exactly the kind of attention she had been trained by necessity to give to everything she was handed. Above her, the valley sky was enormous. Stopped. She had been thinking about this moment for 5 days, about what to say when the granddaughter of Kenji Tanaka stepped onto the land her grandfather had been taken from, and she had arrived at the conclusion that there was nothing to say that would be adequate, and therefore she should say as little as possible and let the land do what land does when someone who belongs to it comes back. Ruth got out of the car slowly, the way people get out of cars when their body requires cooperation rather than just intention. She was small, which Maya hadn't expected, and she had the silver-white hair of someone who had decided at some point to stop pretending about time, and she was wearing practical clothes, good boots and a quilted vest over a flannel shirt, the clothes of someone who had known they were coming to a working piece of ground. She stood at the edge of the gravel and she looked at the almond grove, and then at the farmhouse in the distance, and then at the dry creek bed to the east, and her face did something that was not expressible in simple terms. The way a face looks when it is trying to hold something larger than a face is designed to hold. Maya said, "Welcome home." Ruth turned and looked at her. She had dark eyes that were completely alert and a way of looking at a person that took the whole person in rather than just the surface of them. She said, "Thank you for calling me." Maya said, "Thank you for coming." They stood for a moment. Then Ruth looked past her toward the southeast corner of the property and said, "I want to see the east fence first." They walked there together, the two of them, without the children and without Veronica and without anyone else. Just the two of them moving through the November afternoon across the ground that Ichiro Tanaka had bought in 1899 and that Kenji Tanaka had farmed until he couldn't, and that Eduardo Torres had farmed after him, and that now belonged, legally and specifically, to Maya Torres, whose father had in some way she still didn't fully understand decided that the person who found the thing beneath the floor of the chicken run should be the one who needed to find it most. The marigolds along the east fence were past their peak for the season, but still holding. The orange-yellow of them faded slightly into the deeper gold that comes in late fall, the plants legible against the brown wire and the dry grass beyond it. Ruth stopped when she saw them. She put one hand on the fence post and looked at the flowers for a long time. She said, "My grandmother always grew them in the fall. Said they were better than calendars. Said when the marigold goes gold instead of yellow, you know the year is finishing." Maya said nothing. Ruth crouched down, slowly, with the deliberate movement of someone who has learned to manage their body's limits without conceding to them, and she touched one of the flowers with 2 fingers, not picking it, just touching it the way you touch something you're not sure is real. She said, 80 years. Maya said, every year. Ruth stayed crouched for a moment. Then she stood and she looked at the east fence all the way to the corner and back, the long line of gold and orange running along the wire in the low afternoon light. And she said, my father thought she was wrong to hope. He thought hope was a way of prolonging grief. He said the best thing was to build something new and stop looking back. She paused. But she used to say, my grandmother, she used to say that the land doesn't stop belonging to the people who worked it just because someone takes the papers away. She said the papers are just the papers. The work is the work. She looked at Maya. She said, she was right, wasn't she? Maya said yes. They went to the chamber. Maya went down the ladder first, and Ruth came down after her, more slowly, testing each rung, but without hesitation. When Ruth reached the bottom and turned, and her phone light swept the chamber, she made no sound. She stood and she looked, and she was very still. After a while she walked to the cabinet. She put her hand on the top of it where the marigold jar had sat before Maya brought it up. She could see the pale outline it had left in the dust, a circle of slightly different color where the jar had rested for 80 years. Maya brought the jar from her jacket pocket. She held it out. Ruth took it. She held it in both hands the way Maya had held it. She lifted the lid. She looked at the earth inside, and the seed. She said, I know what this is. Maya said, I thought you might. Ruth replaced the lid. She held the jar against her chest, and she looked around the chamber at the crates and the cylinders and the cabinet, at the stone walls her great-grandfather had laid with his hands in a valley that he had come to on a boat from a country he had never stopped loving, and had worked for 50 years because he believed that honest work built something that couldn't be taken. He was wrong about that, Ruth said quietly. It can be taken. He was wrong. She paused. But he was right that it stays anyway. She held up the jar. It stays in the earth and in the seed and in the flower that comes back every year whether anyone plants it or not. It stays. Maya said, I want to give you the deed. Your grandfather's original deed. Whatever the legal situation requires, I want you to have the document itself. And I want to find a way to make the rest of what's in here mean something for your family that your grandfather would recognize as the kind of meaning he intended. Ruth looked at her for a long time. Then she said, he wrote that you would understand. He didn't know you existed. He didn't know anything about who would find it. But he wrote that the person who found it would understand what it was for. Maya said, I think he understood that the right person would come when the right person needed to. Ruth smiled, and the smile was her grandmother's. Maya somehow knew this. The smile of someone who had been stubborn enough about the right things for long enough to have earned it. She said, what do you want to do with the land? Maya said, I want to farm it. I want to keep the almonds. I want to plant a garden along the east fence that has marigolds in it, because I think that matters. And I want to build something on the quarter-acre that I own that is worth building. Ruth said, what do you want to build? Maya said, something your grandfather would have approved of. The probate court hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of November, and Richard had hired 2 attorneys from Fresno, which Maya registered as a signal about how seriously he was taking it, or about how much he knew was at stake, or about both, which was probably the most accurate reading. Veronica had prepared for 6 weeks with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this case was either going to be the one she talked about for the rest of her career or the one she never mentioned again, and she wanted very badly for it to be the former. The challenge Richard had filed rested on 3 arguments. The first was Eduardo's alleged cognitive decline. The second was that the will was inequitable given the undiscovered assets, and that California law provided for reconsideration of estate distributions when material facts were unknown at the time of execution. The third was a claim that Richard, as the person who had managed the estate in Eduardo's final years, had an equitable interest in all property that had accrued value under his stewardship. The third argument was the one that told Maya what she needed to know about how her brother had approached this. An equitable interest accrued through stewardship was the argument of a person who had understood there was something on the property and had been close enough to it to believe he could claim a share of it retroactively through the language of contribution and management. It was not the argument of someone who was simply surprised by a discovery. Veronica had found the thing that made the difference. She had found it by doing what lawyers do when they understand that the facts matter more than the arguments. which is to look at every document that had been produced around the estate in the 5 years before Eduardo's death. And in the stack of those documents, she had found a letter. The letter was from Eduardo to Richard, dated 3 years before Eduardo's death, in Eduardo's handwriting, which was difficult in the way that handwriting gets difficult toward the end of a life lived largely in the outdoors rather than at a desk, but which was legible if you were patient with it. It was not long. It said essentially one thing. It said that the henhouse floor had a door in it, and that the door led to a room, and that the room had things in it that had been there since before Eduardo bought the property, and that Eduardo had looked at them once, in the first year after he bought the land, and had closed the door and not gone back, because the things were not his, and he didn't know enough about them to know what to do. It said that he had thought about this for 30 years, and had decided that the right thing was to leave it for the child of his who would know what to do with something that wasn't originally hers, and had been left behind by someone who deserved better. It said that Richard should not go into the room. The letter had been in Richard's files. Not filed prominently. Not flagged. In a manila folder labeled Estate Correspondence, among dozens of other letters, in a filing cabinet in the office of Richard's home, which Veronica had subpoenaed as part of the discovery process and which Richard had produced because refusing would have been worse. The letter confirmed 3 things that mattered in court. It confirmed that Eduardo had legal capacity and clear intention at the time described. It confirmed that the designation of the henhouse to Maya was deliberate and informed. And it confirmed that Richard had known there was something in the chamber before Maya ever drove to Tulare County. Judge Patricia Anaya read the letter in open court on a Tuesday morning in November with the expression of someone who has seen a great many things in probate proceedings and is rarely surprised, and is currently experiencing an exception to that pattern. She read it twice. She looked at Richard. Richard's lead attorney said something about the letter's relevance being limited to questions of intent and that it did not address the equitable distribution argument. Judge Anaya said that she found the intent question fairly settled. She took the matter under advisement and returned her ruling 4 days later. It was 23 pages long, which is extensive for a probate ruling, and it addressed each of Richard's 3 arguments in sequence with the thoroughness of someone who wants to leave no surface for a reasonable appeal. On Eduardo's cognition, the evidence supported full legal capacity at the time of the will's execution. The specific and unusual language of the will, particularly the designation of the henhouse structure, demonstrated a level of deliberate and precise intent inconsistent with cognitive impairment. The motion on these grounds was denied. On equitable distribution, California law did provide for reconsideration when material facts were unknown at execution, but the letter from Eduardo to Richard demonstrated that the existence of the chamber and its contents was not unknown to all parties, and that the deliberate and specific designation of the structure to Maya was made with that knowledge by the testator. The distribution stood as written. On Richard's equitable interest through stewardship, the court found this argument without basis in law or equity. Management of an estate does not create an ownership interest in undiscovered assets on that estate, and the letter from Eduardo specifically instructing Richard not to enter the chamber directly undermined any claim of stewardship interest over its contents. The motion was denied. The ruling concluded with a paragraph that was not strictly required but which Judge Anaya had included, and which Veronica read aloud to Maya over the phone with the particular quality of voice that said she was trying to be professional about something that was making her want to do something undignified. The court noted that the designation of property to an heir perceived by others as receiving less than their share is a decision that falls entirely within a testator's legal authority, and that the apparent generosity of a bequest is not measured by its initial appearance, but by what a person of good character chooses to do with it. The court found that the designated heir had demonstrated exactly the character that the testator had apparently anticipated. Maya was sitting on the ground outside the covered section when Veronica read her that paragraph. In the November sun with her jacket on and the almond grove visible to the north, and she held the phone and listened, and then she said, "Thank you." She said it to Veronica, and she said it, quietly and not on the phone, to her father and to Kenji Tanaka and to the valley and to whoever or whatever had arranged for a flyer to hit a windshield and a woman to bid on an abandoned Victorian and for an eviction notice to arrive on a Tuesday morning and for all the other arrangements that put people in the places where they find the things they were meant to find. She called Richard after she called Veronica. He answered on the fourth ring. She did not know where he was or what he looked like in that moment, whether he was at his desk or in his car or standing in the kitchen of the farmhouse that Eduardo had left him, the farmhouse with its 31 years of accumulated life, the heavy dark furniture, and Eduardo's chair by the window that looked out at the almond trees. She said, "The ruling came through." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not calling to say I told you so." He was quiet. She said, "I'm calling because you're my brother and because Dad left you the farmhouse and the groves, which are worth something, and because whatever you thought was in that floor, it wasn't yours to calculate on. And I think some part of you knew that, or you would have opened it yourself instead of making sure I was the one who inherited the structure." He was quiet for longer. She said, "I don't know if you put me in that will because you thought I'd find it and you'd have a legal argument for a share, or because on some level you understood that I was the one who should. I'm choosing to believe it was the second one. I think that's what Dad believed too, or he wouldn't have written you that letter." Richard said, in a voice that was stripped of the attorney's precision she was accustomed to, "I didn't know what was there. I knew there was something. I didn't know it was that." She said, "What did you think it was?" He said, "I thought it might be the original title documents. Something that would complicate the property history. Something that would be easier for everyone if it stayed where it was." She said, "It was complicated, and it was better for everyone that it didn't stay where it was." He said, "I'm sorry, Maya." She sat with that for a moment. It was the first time in her memory that her brother had said those words to her in that order, and she understood them to be genuine, which did not undo anything, but which was still, she found, something. Not nothing. She said, "Come out and see it sometime. When you're ready. I want to show you what it is." He said he would. She believed him, approximately. Sandra called that evening. Her call was shorter and more pragmatic, which was consistent with who Sandra was, and it contained a version of apology that was more about the future than about the past, which was also consistent with who Sandra was. She said that Gerald's development contact was no longer relevant. She said she hoped things went well. She said she would like to see the kids. Maya said, "Come for Christmas." Sandra said she would check with Gerald. Maya said, "Come without Gerald if Gerald doesn't want to come." There was a pause. Then Sandra said, "Okay." Charles Adeyemi returned with his full authentication team in the third week of November. 4 people in total, working across 11 days, cataloging every item individually with the precision and documentation that would be required to move any of the assets through legitimate auction or private sale channels. He brought a numismatist from San Francisco who spent 3 full days with the coins alone, each one handled in white cotton gloves and photographed and assessed, and logged with the patient focus of someone who understood that she was looking at a collection that had not been seen since 1942 and that would not be seen again in the same form after this. The coins were extraordinary. The double eagles, which were the $20 gold pieces minted from 1849 to 1933, ranged in condition from good to mint state, with several examples and grades that the numismatist said she had not personally encountered outside of institutional collections. Several of the dates in the collection were key dates, the ones that collectors pursue for years without finding, and the combination of dates and grades and the coherence of the collection as a whole, the fact that it had been assembled with knowledge and intention by someone who understood what he was buying and why, made it worth significantly more than the sum of its individual pieces. The Liberty Head coins were similarly assembled with care. Ichiro Tanaka had apparently been a man who understood the difference between accumulating gold and collecting it, and the 50 years of his accumulation had produced something that the numismatist described as a defining collection of its era. The bullion bars were assayed on site by a specialist Adeyemi brought from Los Angeles. The purity came back at .992, which was exceptional for bars refined in the early 20th century from placer gold, and which suggested that whoever had done the refining had understood what they were doing and had done it well. 40 bars at 400 troy ounces each at current gold prices. The bronze drums were assessed by a specialist in Japanese antiquities who flew from New York and who spent 2 days in the chamber with them, photographing and measuring and cross-referencing against catalog records before she climbed the ladder and sat at the folding table and told Maya what she was looking at. 18th century, she said. Edo period, consistent with the Kyushu regional style, probably from a temple that had been decommissioned or damaged in the early Meiji period when Buddhist institutions were under significant political pressure. The drums were not unique. Similar examples existed in museum collections in Tokyo and Kyoto and in a private collection in Paris. But the condition was exceptional and the provenance, once documented, would be among the most detailed of any comparable pieces on the current market. The ceramics required the most time. The kills and periods represented in the collection spanned 3 centuries of Japanese ceramic tradition, and several pieces were beyond anything Adeyemi had personally assessed, requiring extended consultation with specialists who reviewed his photographs remotely and whose preliminary responses were, in the language of professional expertise, the equivalent of barely contained astonishment. On the 12th day, Adeyemi sat at the folding table in the covered section of the chicken run, and he produced a document that was 11 pages long, and that represented the collective assessment of 6 experts across 12 days, and he put it on the table in front of Maya, and he said, "The final authenticated valuation, subject to market conditions at the time of any sale and to the auction results for the numismatic pieces, which will depend on timing and presentation." The number at the bottom of the final page was $304 million. $304 million. Maya read it. She read it again. She put the document on the table and she looked at the wire walls and the repaired base posts, which Pete Galvez had finished replacing the week before, and the new tin on the south section of the roof, and the October light coming through the wire in the long rectangles it cast across the floor of the covered section. She thought about $314 in a checking account. She thought about duct tape on work shoes and granola bars in a cooler and a Visa card with $3,890 on it for an ear infection. She thought about a pink eviction notice and a car reclaimed from a grocery store parking lot and 3 jobs that together didn't pay for cereal and an electric bill and the particular arithmetic of a life that required constant management just to stay in the same place. She thought about her father's voice saying, "You're doing all right, Emija." She looked at the number. She let it be what it was. Diego came in from wherever he'd been, carrying a stick as he almost always carried a stick, and he looked at the document on the table and said, "Is that a lot of numbers?" Maya said yes. He looked at it more closely, with the arithmetic focus of a second grader who was currently proud of being able to read numbers into the millions. He said, "That's a lot of zeros." "Yes." He looked at her face. He said, "Is that good?" "Yes," she said. "That's good." He nodded. He went back outside. She heard him talking to the marigolds, which was a thing he had started doing, walking along the east fence and addressing them by names he'd assigned based on a system that Maya had not entirely figured out. She picked up the document. She put it in the folder with the letters and the manifest and the court ruling and Veronica's correspondence and the photographs Adeyemi had taken and all the other papers that were accumulating into the record of this thing, this inheritance that was not supposed to be worth anything. Ruth came back to the property 2 weeks later, and this time she brought her daughter, a woman in her 50s named Carol who had Ruth's eyes and who had been skeptical of the whole situation in the way that adult children are skeptical of things that seem too large to be true until they descend a ladder into a stone chamber and see the evidence with their own eyes. Carol stood in the chamber for 15 minutes and didn't say anything, and then came back up the ladder and said, in a voice that was doing its best to be ordinary, "My great-great-grandfather built this." Maya said yes. Carol said, "With his hands." Maya said, "In 1904. The stone walls and the ladder and the cabinet and all of it. He built it in 1904 and sealed it in 1942, and here it is." Carol sat down on the edge of the covered section's wooden floor, and she looked at the sky through the wire canopy above her, and she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My grandmother used to say something when things were unfair. She'd say, 'The land keeps score.' She said it her whole life, right up until she died." Maya looked at her. Carol said, "I used to think it was magical thinking. I used to think she said it because she couldn't accept that the world is just unfair and that's the end of it. Now I think she was describing something real, just not in scientific language." Maya said, "What do you think she meant?" Carol looked at the east fence, visible through the wire wall, at the marigolds, still holding into November in the stubbornness they'd been doing for 8 decades. She said, "I think she meant that honest work doesn't disappear, that it goes into the ground, that it comes back up when the conditions are right, that it doesn't need anyone to remember it because it just keeps being true." She paused. "I think she meant that the land keeps the record of what was done on it and who did it, and eventually it shows." Maya said, Your great-great-grandfather left a letter in a jar on top of a cabinet in a sealed chamber, and it waited 80 years for someone to open it, and I think he believed that too. Carol looked at her. She said, "What are you going to do?" Maya said, "I need to talk to you and Ruth about that." The conversation happened at the folding table in the covered section, which had become the place where important things were said, as if the structure itself had decided to serve as a table of counsel after decades of serving as a home for chickens. It was Maya and Veronica and Ruth and Carol and Susan Mori from the Japanese American Citizens League and a man named Tom Ashida, who was an attorney specializing in Japanese American reparations law, who Susan had brought from Sacramento. Maya began by saying that she did not intend to dispute the inheritance. The court had ruled and Veronica had defended it, and the assets were legally hers. She said this plainly, so there was no ambiguity. She also said that there was a difference between what was legal and what was right, and that Kenji Tanaka had trusted the person who found his letter to understand that difference, and she intended to honor that trust. She laid out what she was proposing. 30% of the authenticated value of the Tanaka family's original assets would go to a trust for Ruth and Carol and Ruth's extended family, structured through Tom Ashida's office, to be administered as the family chose. This was not required by law. It was required by the letter. The 7 families listed in Kenji's debt record would be located, or their descendants would be located, to the extent possible. The debts would be repaid at inflation-adjusted value, with interest calculated from 1942. Susan's organization had agreed to assist with the location work. The original deed and all supporting documents would be donated to the Japanese American Citizens League's historical archive, properly preserved and publicly accessible, and the story of the Tanaka family's ownership of this land would become part of the documented record rather than the erased one. And the property itself, the quarter-acre with the chicken run, would be transformed into something. Maya described it without apology or excessive explanation, the way she described things she had decided. A working farm stand in the east corner of the quarter-acre. Almonds and stone fruit from the groves when the groves were producing again. A garden along the east fence that would be maintained and expanded, marigolds along the wire as they had always been, and vegetables and herbs in the ground where Haruko Tanaka's hands had worked. And in the covered section of the chicken run, which would be repaired and properly maintained, a small reading room. Not a museum. Not an exhibit, but a room with a table and chairs and good light through the wire, where the chamber access would remain open and accessible, where Kenji's letter and the manifest and the debt record and the Tanaka family's full story would be available to anyone who came to read it. A room for understanding things that had been buried. Ruth listened to all of this without interrupting. When Maya finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandfather wrote that he trusted you." Maya said, "I know." Ruth said, "He was right too." She reached across the table and took Maya's hand and held it. The way older people sometimes hold hands. Not the handshake of transaction, but the hold of something older and more deliberate. And she said, "My grandmother named her first daughter Haruko and her second daughter Kenji, after her husband, which was not a traditional Japanese name for a girl, but which my grandmother said was the right name because she wanted a daughter who was stubborn and careful and believed in honest work. Kenji died young, before she had children. But the name didn't stop. She left it. She paused. She said, "I want you to know what the jar means. The earth and the seed." Maya said, "Tell me." Ruth said, "On the day they were taken, my grandmother went to the garden first thing in the morning before anyone else was awake, and she took a jar of earth from the bed where she grew the marigolds, and she saved one seed from the plant that had given the most flowers that fall. She said she was going to carry it with her and plant it wherever they ended up." She stopped. She said they weren't allowed to take much. She had to leave the jar. She left it in the room below because she thought that was the safest place in the house. She told my grandfather to put it somewhere it would be found by the right person, and he put it where he put everything else. She looked at the jar, which was sitting on the table between them. She said she carried the seed from the other plant in her coat pocket all the way to the internment camp and all the way back to San Jose after the war, in a folded piece of paper. She planted it in a window box on the third-floor apartment where they lived because they couldn't afford a garden, and it grew, and she saved the seed from it, and she planted it again, and she saved the seed from that one. She did this every year for the rest of her life. She did it until she was 92 and couldn't get out of bed anymore, and then my father did it. and then I did it. Maya looked at her. Ruth said, I have marigolds in my garden in Santa Cruz that are descended in a direct line from the plant my grandmother grew on this fence. 80 years of seeds, one after another, because she believed the land remembers, and she was going to help it. She touched the jar. She said, I think she'd like it very much if that seed went back into the ground here. Maya said, I was going to ask if you'd plant it. Ruth said, I'd like that. They planted it that afternoon, the four of them, Maya and Ruth and Lily and Diego, along the east fence in the November ground. The old seed from the jar and 3 seeds that Ruth had brought from her Santa Cruz garden in a small paper envelope she'd been carrying since she left home. Diego patted the soil over them with great seriousness, and Diego announced that he expected results by spring and that he would be monitoring the situation. Ruth laughed. It was the first time Maya had heard her laugh, and it was a full laugh, unguarded. The laugh of someone who has put down something very heavy and is surprised to find how good that feels. The probate formally closed in December. The assets were legally transferred. Veronica filed the final paperwork and sent Maya a bottle of wine with a card that said this was the most interesting case of my career and also the most right, which is not always the same thing, and I am grateful they coincided. The first sale, a small selection of the Liberty Head coins offered through a specialist auction house in San Francisco, produced enough to pay Pete Galvez for the structural repairs and to pay 3 months of Lily and Diego's school enrollment in the Porterville School District, and to pay off the Visa card entirely, and to put $80,000 in a savings account, and to buy a second-hand refrigerator and a proper stove for the kitchen of the farmhouse, because it turned out that Richard, faced with a court ruling that had been unambiguous on the question of his character, had decided that the right thing to do was to offer Maya use of the farmhouse at no cost for the period she needed it, an offer she had accepted with the directness of someone who is not going to pretend generosity isn't generosity just because it arrived late. She moved the children into the farmhouse in January. Diego immediately claimed Eduardo's chair by the window, which Maya allowed because the chair needed someone in it, and because 7-year-olds sometimes understand instinctively where the weight of a thing should rest. Lily found the kitchen and decided it was her project. She had inherited Eduardo's habit of precise attention to small tasks, and she spent a Saturday cleaning the kitchen with the thoroughness of someone who is not cleaning a room but reclaiming it. And when she finished, she stood in the doorway and said, "This is a good kitchen. It just needed someone to pay attention to it." Maya looked at her daughter. She thought about a woman named Catherine Hayes who had built a house with wages from gutting fish and cleaning other people's homes. About a woman named Sarah Mitchell who had stood in a parking lot with a flyer and decided that possibility was worth $175. About a woman named Haruko Tanaka who had carried a seed across years of forced displacement in a folded piece of paper because she believed that the work you put into the ground does not disappear when someone takes the papers away. She thought about her father, who had farmed 47 acres for 31 years above a room full of another family's life's work, and who had written to his oldest son and said, "Don't go in there. Leave it for the one who will know what to do." She thought about all the people who had stood in places that looked like the least of what was available and had understood, through need or stubbornness or faith or some combination of all three, that what something looks like and what it is are not always the same information. She looked at Lily in the kitchen doorway. She said yes. It just needed someone to pay attention to it. The Dett families were harder to find than Susan Morey had expected and easier than she had feared. 3 of the 7 could not be traced, the records being too sparse and too old for the paper trail to lead anywhere conclusive. But 4 families were found. The Yamamoto family, now living in Sacramento, whose great-grandmother had borrowed $60 from Kenji Tanaka in the spring of 1941 for medical expenses, and who had told the story of the Dett to every generation of her family as an example of how a man could be decent in circumstances that were not decent at all. The Nakamura family in San Jose, who received their letter from Veronica with 3 days of silence before the eldest daughter called and said they had a photograph of Kenji Tanaka, that he was holding her grandmother's baby in the photograph and smiling, that the family had kept the photograph for 80 years because her grandmother said that was what a neighbor looked like and they should remember. The Ogawa family, located through the Japanese American Citizens League, who had lost contact with the Torres land decades before and who, when presented with the debt repayment adjusted for 80 years of inflation, said that the number was impossible And would Maya please explain? And Maya had Veronica explain because the explanation required legal language. She wasn't sure she could keep her voice steady through. And the Flores family, who were not Japanese but Mexican, farm workers who had borrowed from Kenji in 1941 when the harvest was poor, and who the Flores' great-grandmother had described, in a letter found in a shoebox after her death, as the only man in the valley who lent without asking for your shame as collateral. The debt payments were not large numbers by the standards of what the chamber contained, but they were the numbers Kenji had written down on a list because he believed that what you owe is what you owe regardless of what happens after and regardless of whether anyone requires payment. The act of paying them was not about the money. It was about the list being honored. Susan Mori included the debt resolution in the historical record she was building around the Tanaka family story, which was being donated to the Japanese-American National Museum in Los Angeles alongside a permanent exhibit on the interment's impact on Central Valley farming families, which included the Tanaka family's deed and photographs and manifest, and Kenji's letter in a facsimile display that would be seen by thousands of people who would not otherwise have known that this family existed, that they had worked this soil, that they had built a room in the ground to keep the evidence of their life in it because the world they were living in had taught them that evidence was necessary. The reading room in the covered section opened on the first Saturday of March, which Maya had chosen deliberately because it was the month of the almond blossom, and because the valley in March has a quality of beginning that felt like the right context for a room about things that had been buried and had come back up. Pete Galvez had done the renovation. He'd replaced the rotted sections of the frame with matching timber, salvaged from a demolition in Porterville, and he'd treated the new wood to match the color of the old wood, so the repairs were visible if you looked for them and invisible if you didn't, which was the approach Maya had specified, because she wanted the evidence of repair to be there without making the repair the thing you saw first. The wire walls he'd left as they were, cleaned and where necessary retensioned but not replaced, because the wire was original and because there was something important about seeing the structure through the wire, about the way wire lets light in and lets you see out while still defining a boundary, which is not the same thing as a solid wall, and which was, she thought, the right metaphor for what she was trying to build. The reading room had a table that Pete had made from 2 salvaged oak boards, rough-edged and beautiful, and 4 chairs, and a lamp, and 2 shelves against the north wall. On the shelves were copies of Kenji's letter and the manifest and the debt record, available to be handled and read, because documents that cannot be touched are not truly accessible, and accessibility was the whole point. The original documents were in the archive in Los Angeles, but their presence here was in the copies, which were faithful enough that what you read was what Kenji had written. On the wall above the shelves was a framed photograph. Ruth had sent it. It was Haruko Tanaka, standing in the garden along the east fence, probably 1939 or 1940 by the look of her clothes, with the marigolds behind her and the wire of the fence and the flat valley light. And she was looking at the camera with an expression that was composed and direct, and that said, clearly and without ambiguity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, and she knew it. Beneath the photograph was a small card in Maya's handwriting. It said, Haruko Tanaka, 1905 to 1998. She planted the marigolds that are still growing along the east fence. She knew they would be. The seed Ruth had planted in November came up in March, which was not surprising because marigold seeds know what to do and the valley in March is ready for them. Diego reported the emergence with appropriate solemnity and then with considerably less solemnity, running back to the house to tell Lily that the flowers were starting and that he had been right about the timing and that he wanted this noted. Maya stood at the east fence and looked at the green shoots coming up in the ground where Ruth's hands had pressed the seeds in, and she thought about all the hands that had worked this fence line, Haruko's and the unnamed workers before her and Eduardo's, when he trimmed back the plants each fall, because he'd said once on a Sunday phone call that he kept the east fence clear because things grew there on their own and he just made sure they had room. She thought he had known, maybe not what was in the chamber, but that there was something on this land that was not his and that required a certain kind of careful attention and a certain kind of refusal to interfere. You're doing all right, Amija. She looked at the shoots and she said, I hope so, Dad. Lily came to stand beside her. At 12, she was almost Maya's height, a development that had happened quietly over the winter, the way things happen when you're not watching for them. She had spent the winter reading, which was what she had always done. But now she was reading things she chose rather than things that were available. The distinction being meaningful in ways that had to do with having a room of her own and a library card, and the confidence that came from watching your mother stand in a chicken run and refuse to accept someone else's valuation of it. She said, "Are you going to sell the coins?" "Some of them. Over time. The specialists say it's better to do it gradually, that it maintains the value of the collection better and draws more serious collectors." Lily said, "And the rest?" Maya said, "Some will stay in the archive. Some pieces Ruth's family wanted in a private collection that they're building, and I'm contributing several pieces to that. Some go to the museum in Los Angeles, and the bullion will be liquidated over time as needed." Lily said, "How much is left after the trust for Ruth's family and the debt payments and the legal fees and everything?" Maya looked at her daughter. She said, "Enough?" Lily looked back. She understood what this meant. She had understood numbers for a long time, and she was beginning to understand what numbers made possible, which was different from understanding numbers. She said, "What are you going to do with enough?" Maya looked at the farmhouse, which had Eduardo's chair in the window and Pete Galvez's repaired porch boards, and the kitchen that Lily had reclaimed, and at the almond grove to the north that would need proper management to produce again, and at the reading room in the covered section visible through the wire, and at the east fence where the shoots were coming up in the March soil. She said, "I'm going to stop doing arithmetic about survival." Lily said, "What does that mean?" "It means," Maya said, "that I've been calculating how to stay in the same place for 15 years. Every dollar managed against every other dollar, every job against every other job, every month against the next month. And I don't need to do that anymore. So now I can think about what comes next instead of just whether there is a next." Lily was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is that what Dad couldn't do?" Maya looked at her. Michael had not been the kind of man who calculated carefully. He had been the kind of man who trusted that things would work out, and things had not worked out, and then they hadn't worked out again and permanently. And what he had left behind was a particular kind of financial exposure that went from manageable to catastrophic in a Tuesday afternoon. She said, "Your dad did the best he could. He just didn't have the same relationship with numbers that I do." Lily said, "I think I'm more like you." Maya said, "I think so too. I think that's going to serve you very well." She put her arm around her daughter at the east fence in the March light, and they stood and looked at the valley together, at the flatness of it and the bigness of it, and the way the light moved across it in the morning at an angle that made the almond trees cast shadows you could read like a clock if you knew how. Diego came running from the direction of the covered section with the stick he always had and something in his other hand that turned out, when he arrived, to be a marigold petal from one of the established plants along the fence, orange and papery from having been through the winter. He held it out to Maya. He said, "This one made it through." She took it. She said, "Yes, it did." He said, "I'm going to put it on the table in the reading room, for the picture of the lady." He meant Haruko. She said, "That's a good idea." He went, quick and purposeful, carrying his petal toward the reading room the way children carry things they've decided matter, with both the care and the urgency that come from understanding that the moment requires both. Maya held the almond tree shadow, held the east fence, held the green shoots and the March light, and the valley doing what it always did, which was just to be itself, enormous and patient, and full of the accumulated record of everything that had ever been done on it. $304 million was not the number that mattered most. She had understood this from the moment she read it on Adeyemi's final page. The number that mattered was the one she'd had when she drove into Tulare County with 2 children and a cooler, because that was the number that described who she was when she made the choice that led to all the other choices. When she got out of the car and walked to the covered section and crouched in the dust and found a seam in the floor that was too straight to be accidental. She had been the person with $314 and a cast iron pan and enough attention to notice what everyone else had already looked away from. That was the number. That was the inheritance. The rest was just what the land had kept for the person who would finally pay attention to it. She walked back toward the farmhouse, back through the almond grove where the trees were beginning to show their early blossoms, white and small and unremarkable until you got close enough to see that each one was exactly what it was supposed to be, and that the whole grove was full of them, and that Eduardo Torres had tended them for 31 years above a chamber of buried treasure and had done it with the same daily faithfulness that Ichiro Tanaka had brought to the same ground before him. Ordinary work done with extraordinary consistency is not ordinary at all. She had learned this. She walked through the grove and across the equipment pad and past the collapsed shed, which she was going to have Pete Galvez clear in the spring, and she came to the covered section, and she stood at the wire gate and looked into the reading room, where Diego was carefully placing his marigold petal on the edge of the table beneath Haruko's photograph, adjusting it with the seriousness of a person who has decided something is important and wants the placement to be right. The petal sat on the table. Diego stood back and looked at it, and then looked at Haruko's photograph and nodded, satisfied with the arrangement. Then he looked up and saw Maya at the gate. He said, "Mom, did Grandpa Eduardo know about the room?" She said, "Yes, I think he did." He said, "Why didn't he tell us?" She looked at her son, at his 7-year-old face asking a 7-year-old's honest question, and she said, "Because he knew that the right person would find it when they were ready, and he believed that person was me." Diego thought about this. He said, "Because you're stubborn?" She laughed. She said, "Yes, partly because of that." He said, "I'm stubborn too." She said, "I know." He looked pleased. He picked up his stick and his petal was on the table and Haruko was in her frame and the marigolds were coming up in the east fence soil and the almond trees were blossoming in the grove and the valley went on in every direction, flat and immense and full of the record of everything that had been done in it and on it and for it by the people who had decided it was worth staying for. Maya Torres had been given the worst part of her father's estate. She had accepted it without performance, without self-pity, without anything except the habit of looking at what she actually had rather than what she wished she had, which was the only kind of looking that finds what's really there. Beneath the wire floor of the least valuable thing on 47 acres of Central Valley farmland, she had found $304 million and 2 families' worth of honest work and a letter from 1942 that had waited for the right person with the patience of something that had been sealed in the dark and trusted to last. It had lasted. She had found it. And what she built from it was not a monument to what she'd endured, or a revenge on those who had underestimated her, or even a proof of anything. It was just what it was, a farm with almonds and marigolds, and a reading room in a repaired chicken run where the door to the chamber stayed open and the record of the people who had worked this ground was available to anyone who came to read it. Some inheritances,